A city's greatest strength could become its ultimate weakness. We remember Roman aqueducts as peaceful marvels of engineering, but they concealed a military secret. This is the story of how Roman engineers weaponized city aqueducts during major imperial sieges. By the end, you will understand the calculated methods that turned water into a tool for conquest. How did an empire use flowing water to break unbreachable walls, and what does it reveal about the nature of power itself? We often see these stone channels as lifelines, but in wartime, they became levers of control. Prepare to discover a hidden dimension of ancient strategy where engineering brilliance served a darker, more pragmatic purpose. What does it mean when the very symbol of a civilization's care can be twisted into an instrument of its defeat? Rome's aqueducts were a declaration of peace that doubled as a blueprint for war. These graceful stone channels curving across the landscape represented more than just engineering. They were a city's primary artery, and in the ancient world, controlling that artery meant holding the power of life and death over everyone inside the walls. This was a truth understood not just by generals, but by the empire's own water commissioners, men like Sextus Julius Frontinus, who personally managed Rome's water supply, wrote extensively about its dual nature. He saw the aqueducts as the very foundation of civic order and public health, but his writings make it clear he also viewed them through a starkly military lens. For Frontinus, a reliable water source was as critical to an army's campaign as its weapons or fortifications. This reveals the core strategic principle at play. In any prolonged siege, the ultimate goal is to break the enemy's will and their physical capacity to resist. You can batter walls for months, but if you can compromise the one resource no human can survive without, you achieve your objective with terrifying efficiency. The scale of these systems made them uniquely valuable targets. A single major aqueduct, like the Aqua Claudia serving Rome, could deliver tens of millions of gallons of fresh water every single day. It supported not only drinking and bathing, but also mills, tanneries, and public fountains that were the social heart of a city. To sever that flow was to initiate a slow, silent crisis. Thirst is a relentless enemy. It erodes morale, saps strength, and forces desperate choices long before the first battering ram touches the gate. So while these structures were celebrated as gifts of civilization, their design and their very existence created a vulnerability that Roman commanders studied with cold, calculating precision. The stage was now set. The aqueduct was recognized as the ultimate strategic asset. The question became not if it could be used as a weapon, but how. The most elegant weapon is often the quietest one. While we envision sieges as thunderous assaults, the opening move in this hydraulic war was frequently silent and unseen. Roman engineers understood that to conquer a city, you did not always need to break its walls. You simply needed to redirect its lifeline. This first tactic, the strategic diversion, transformed the aqueduct from a conduit of life into a tool of slow, methodical pressure. It began not with violence, but with surveyors and hydrologists. Before a single soldier dug a trench, these specialists would meticulously map the terrain upstream from the city, searching for the precise point where the aqueduct channel drew its water from a spring or river. Their goal was to find a location where a relatively modest earthwork, a dam or a redirected channel, could intercept that flow. Under the cover of darkness, legionaries would become laborers, moving thousands of tons of earth and stone to construct a new path for the water. This was not a temporary blockage. It was a permanent rerouting of a city's primary artery. The diverted water would then be channeled directly into the Roman camp, solving one of the besieging army's greatest logistical challenges, supplying fresh water to tens of thousands of men and animals. Meanwhile, inside the city, the public fountains would run dry, the baths would close, the tanneries and mills would grind to a halt. A profound silence would descend where the comforting rush of water once flowed. The crisis would unfold not in days but over weeks and months. Thirst is a creeping enemy. It saps energy, clouds judgment, and turns neighbor against neighbor as hidden cisterns become more precious than gold. The historical record offers a stark example in the siege of Numantia in what we now call 133 before Common Era. The Roman commander Scipio Aemilianus faced a formidable Celtiberian fortress in the hills of Spain, a place that had resisted previous attacks. Rather than launch a costly frontal assault, he ordered his engineers to encircle the city with fortifications, a tactic known as a circumvallation, but the true masterstroke was hydrological. Historical accounts suggest his forces worked to control the local water sources, effectively diverting the supply that fed Numantia. The defenders, cut off and slowly dehydrating, were worn down not by swords but by scarcity. Their eventual surrender was less a military defeat and more the inevitable conclusion of a calculated engineering operation. The brilliance of this tactic lay in its economy of force. It conserved Roman lives while imposing an unbearable cost on the besieged. It turned the city's own infrastructure against it, proving that sometimes the most powerful siege engine is not a tower or a ram, but a simple shovel in the right hands at the right place, far from the sound of battle. But deprivation was only the first layer of this strategy. A more chilling tactic involved not taking the water away, but deliberately poisoning it. This was an act that transformed the aqueduct from a severed lifeline into an active agent of suffering, a form of early biological warfare that targeted the health of an entire city. The principle was brutally simple. If you could not starve a population out quickly enough, you could sicken them from within, eroding their capacity to resist through illness and fear. Roman military engineers were practical above all else, and they understood the properties of contamination. An aqueduct's channel, often open to the elements for miles before entering the city, presented a glaring vulnerability. A small team operating far upstream beyond the sight of the city's defenders could introduce agents designed to pollute the flow. This contamination could take several forms. The most direct method involved dumping large quantities of animal remains or other decaying organic matter directly into the water source. As this material traveled downstream, it would foul the water, introducing bacteria and pathogens that could cause widespread illness. Other accounts suggest the use of known toxic substances, like certain mineral salts or poisonous plants, substances whose dangerous effects were documented by naturalists of the era. The historian Cassius Dio, writing centuries later, alludes to such grim tactics being employed during various conflicts, though the details are often left vague, perhaps because the practice was considered a severe breach of customary warfare, even by Roman standards. The true power of this method, however, was psychological. Imagine the moment inside the besieged city when the public fountains, the last symbol of civic order, began to emit a foul odor. When the once clear water ran cloudy or discolored, the terror would be immediate and paralyzing. Every drink of water, the most basic act of survival, would become a potential gamble. Do you risk dehydration, or do you risk a debilitating, possibly fatal, illness? This internal conflict would fracture community morale far more effectively than any external threat. Trust would evaporate. People would hoard any remaining clean water, turning neighbor against neighbor. The leadership's authority would crumble as they proved powerless to protect their citizens from this invisible enemy flowing through their own pipes. It was a weapon that attacked the body and the spirit simultaneously, creating a climate of dread and desperation that made surrender seem like the only path to safety. This dark innovation reveals a cold calculus. where engineering knowledge was applied not to sustain life, but to systematically undermine it, using the city's greatest wonder as the delivery system for its own distress. The most devastating tactic reversed the entire purpose of the system. If you could weaponize the absence of water, what could you achieve with its sudden, overwhelming return? The third method was the controlled flood, a calculated deluge engineered not by nature but by military command. This approach required a different kind of precision, transforming the aqueduct from a steady stream into a temporary reservoir of potential energy waiting to be unleashed. The process began with a strategic dam. Engineers would identify a section of the aqueduct channel, often in a narrow gorge or a raised section of the arcade, and seal it completely. For days or even weeks, the water destined for the city would pool behind this artificial barrier, creating a growing lake held in check by stone and mortar. The besieging army would then prepare the battlefield, perhaps encouraging enemy forces to concentrate in a low-lying area or to build their own defensive earthworks in a predictable location. Then, at the chosen moment, the dam was breached. The result was not a gentle return of the flow, but a roaring, churning wall of water and debris hurtling down the channel's course. This directed torrent served multiple brutal purposes. It could scour away defensive trenches and palisades in an instant, turning carefully prepared positions into rivers of mud. It could undermine the foundations of siege towers or battering rams built by the defenders, washing away months of labor in a few violent minutes. In some scenarios, the flood could be channeled to create impassable quagmires, effectively cutting off one section of a city's defenses from another and isolating pockets of resistance. The historical siege of Jerusalem in the year 70 offers a compelling, though debated, case study. The city possessed a complex network of pools, cisterns, and channels. Some analyses of the historical accounts suggest that the Roman forces under the command of Titus, perhaps intentionally or through the collateral damage of their assault, managed to disrupt or manipulate these water systems. The result was not a single catastrophic flood, but a series of controlled releases or breaches that turned sections of the urban landscape into treacherous, flooded zones, hampering the defenders' movements and disrupting their coordination during the final, desperate stages of the conflict. This tactic showcases the pinnacle of hydraulic weaponization. It demanded an intimate understanding of volume, pressure, and topography. The engineers were not just stopping water, they were storing it, aiming it, and releasing it with the destructive force of a natural disaster, but one with perfect timing. It was the ultimate demonstration of turning a city's own lifeblood into a weapon of mass disruption, proving that in the hands of a Roman siege master, even the most benevolent engineering could be made to roar. The stone arteries built for water could, with enough daring, carry men. This fourth tactic moved beyond manipulating flow to physically invading the structure itself, transforming the aqueduct from a channel into a clandestine highway. Roman military engineers recognized that these massive stone conduits, known as specus, were not just pipes, they were ready-made tunnels, often large enough for a person to crawl through, and frequently passing beneath city walls or through the bedrock of hillsides. They presented a literal back door into the heart of a besieged fortress. This was the work of the sappers, the army's underground specialists. Their task was twofold. In some cases, they would locate the point where an aqueduct passed under a wall, then use the conduit as a perfect starting point for a larger siege mine. They would dig out from the specus, shoring up the tunnel with timber as they went, aiming to reach directly beneath a key tower or section of the wall. Once there, they would create a chamber, fill it with combustible material, and set it ablaze. The supporting timbers would burn away, causing the tunnel to collapse and, with luck, bringing the fortifications above crashing down in a cloud of dust and rubble. The aqueduct had provided the hidden approach. In other, even bolder scenarios, small teams of specialized soldiers would use the conduit not for digging, but for direct infiltration. Moving in silence through the cold, dark channel, often wading through shallow water, they would emerge inside the city's water distribution center, the Castellum Aquae. From this secured position, they could launch a surprise attack to open a main gate or cause targeted chaos, allowing the main force outside to storm through the breach. The success of such an operation depended entirely on detailed, intimate knowledge of the enemy's infrastructure. This intelligence was often gathered months or even years in advance by spies, merchants, or deserters who could provide maps or descriptions of the water system's layout. The siege of the Italian city of Falerii in the year 394 before Common Era, as recounted by historians like Livy, offers a legendary example of this principle. While not involving an aqueduct in the classical Roman sense, the story tells of a Roman schoolteacher who knew the secret paths into the city and offered to lead Roman soldiers through them. The Roman commander famously rejected this betrayal of trust, but the tale underscores a timeless military truth. Knowledge of a city's hidden pathways is a weapon of immense power. To weaponize an aqueduct in this way was the ultimate perversion of its purpose. It took the symbol of civic transparency, the open flow of a public good, and turned it into a vessel for secrecy and surprise. It demonstrated that in the calculus of siege warfare, no feature of the landscape or architecture was neutral. Every bridge, every road, and every channel of fresh water had to be viewed through a dual lens as a giver of life and as a potential vector for conquest. Behind every silent diversion and calculated flood stood a unique kind of strategist. The Roman legions were famous for their discipline and strength, but their true edge often came from the minds of the architectus militaris, the military engineer. These men were far more than builders. They were tactical officers, scholars of the battlefield who wielded knowledge as their primary weapon. Trained in geometry, hydraulics, and mechanics, their role was to solve the complex puzzles of conquest, and the weaponization of water was one of their most sophisticated arts. A figure like Vitruvius, who served under Julius Caesar, embodies this blend of intellect and practicality. In his famous work, De Architectura, he dedicates entire sections to the science of aqueducts, the finding of water, and the principles of siegecraft. His writings were not just theoretical, they were field manuals for turning landscape and infrastructure into instruments of victory. The job of the architectus militaris began long before the army arrived. He would study maps, interrogate merchants and prisoners about local geography, and most importantly, he would seek detailed information about a city's water sources. Where were the springs? How were the aqueduct channels routed? Where were the main cisterns? This intelligence was as valuable as knowing the number of enemy soldiers. On campaign, his toolkit was as specialized as a surgeon's. The corabates, a precise leveling instrument often over 20 feet long, allowed him to map gradients with astonishing accuracy, essential for plotting where to divert a channel or build a dam. The groma, a cross-shaped surveying tool, let him lay out perfect lines for siege works and calculate distances. Perhaps most critically, he possessed a deep understanding of siphon mechanics, knowing how to force water up and over hills within pressurized pipes, a knowledge that could also be used to predict and exploit weaknesses in an enemy's system. These engineers were the ultimate problem solvers, translating abstract principles of physics into tangible results on the ground. They decided where to dig, where to dam, and when to breach. In doing so, they proved that Roman warfare was a symphony of force and intellect, where the quiet calculations of a scholar in a tent could achieve what 10,000 shouting soldiers could not. To understand their full impact, we must look past their plans and examine the physical machines they brought to life. These brilliant plans were worthless without the physical means to execute them. To turn theory into reality, Roman engineers relied on a specialized arsenal of tools, instruments designed not for combat, but for the meticulous manipulation of earth and water. Their toolkit reveals the industrial scale of this hydraulic warfare, showing that weaponizing an aqueduct was a massive, premeditated engineering project. First, consider the movement of water itself. For large-scale diversion or the draining of moats and marshes around a city, the Romans employed machines of surprising sophistication. The water screw, often attributed to Archimedes, was a brilliant spiral encased in a cylinder. When turned by hand or by a treadwheel, it could lift water from a low point to a higher one. In a siege context, this tool could be used in reverse, to rapidly drain a defensive ditch, or to pump water from a newly redirected stream directly into the legion's own storage ponds. For even greater volume, they constructed massive water wheels, sometimes powered by the current of the very river they were manipulating. These wheels would turn a continuous loop of clay pots or wooden buckets, creating a relentless chain that could lift thousands of gallons an hour, steadily depleting a city's external water sources or supplying the vast needs of the besieging camp. Then came the work of reshaping the land. The creation of a temporary dam to block or flood an aqueduct channel was a feat of military labor. It required vast quantities of timber, earth, and stone, all hauled into position under the constant threat of enemy attack. Legionaries became lumberjacks, miners, and masons, working in shifts around the clock. They used heavy iron picks and shovels to dig foundation trenches and woven baskets to move tons of earth. The dam itself was a layered construction, often starting with a framework of driven wooden piles, then filled with rubble, clay, and more timber for reinforcement. This was not a haphazard pile of dirt. It was a structurally sound barrier built to withstand immense hydraulic pressure until the moment the engineers chose to breach it. Most perilous was the work inside the aqueducts themselves. Teams of sappers, armed with short-handled picks and iron bars, would chip away at stone or dig through packed earth to access the specus, the water channel. Once inside, their work was conducted in near darkness, the air thick with damp and the constant fear of collapse. To prevent this, they brought in wooden shoring, beams cut and fitted with precise joints to hold up the ceiling as they dug their secret tunnel outward. Their most critical tools, however, were for measurement: the libra, a simple but effective level, and the groma for aligning their tunnel's course, were as vital as their picks. A miscalculation of a few degrees could mean tunneling uselessly into solid rock, or worse, causing a catastrophic collapse that would bury the team and reveal their plan. Every swing of the pick, every placement of a timber brace, was guided by cold geometry. Understanding these tools shifts our perspective entirely. It moves us from the grand strategy in the commander's tent to the gritty, dangerous reality of execution. It shows that turning an aqueduct into a weapon was not a single act of sabotage, but a sustained campaign of industrial engineering, where the muscle of the legion served the mind of the architectus. This calculated machinery of conquest finds its ultimate expression in the stories of specific, legendary sieges, where theory, tools, and ruthless will converged. The story of Veii is a legend of patience and subterranean cunning. For 10 long years, the armies of the young Roman Republic laid siege to this powerful Etruscan city, its walls seemingly unbreakable. The turning point, as the historian Livy recounts, came not from a dramatic charge, but from a slow, deliberate dig. While Veii did not possess the soaring stone aqueducts of later eras, it was a city rich with water, fed by deep wells and an intricate network of underground cisterns and drainage tunnels carved into the soft volcanic rock. This is where Roman ingenuity found its opening. The commander Marcus Furius Camillus, faced with a stalemate, ordered his engineers and soldiers to begin a secret project. They started a tunnel or a mine, aiming to burrow beneath Veii's formidable walls and emerge directly within the city's citadel. The work was grueling and dangerous, conducted in shifts day and night, the men shoring up the passage with timber as they inched forward through the earth. But here is where the story connects to our theme of water. Many historians analyzing Livy's account suggest this famous tunnel did not simply travel through blank earth. It is highly plausible, even likely, that the Roman sappers intentionally intersected or followed one of Veei's own hydrological tunnels. These pre-existing channels, part of the city's water management system, would have provided a ready-made guide, a hidden map leading straight into the heart of the fortress. By using the city's own infrastructure as a blueprint, the Romans turned a symbol of Veei's sophistication into its critical vulnerability. The climax was as dramatic as it was brutal. After months of digging, the tunnel was complete. On a predetermined day, while Roman forces staged a noisy diversionary attack on the walls, a picked force of soldiers emerged silently from the ground inside the Temple of Juno, which stood on Veei's Acropolis. They opened the city gates from within, and the siege ended in a sudden, decisive storm. The fall of Veii was a seismic event for Rome, granting it control of vast territory and resources. But its deeper legacy was a lesson in applied engineering. It proved that a city's greatest strengths, its high walls and its secure water supply, could be mentally connected. The patient, analytical approach of undermining and resource denial had triumphed over raw force. This early example set a psychological and tactical precedent. It showed generations of future Roman commanders that conquest could be a cerebral exercise, a puzzle to be solved with picks, shovels, and a profound understanding of how an enemy city truly functioned from the ground up. The Siege of Veii was a prototype, a rough draft of the more refined hydraulic warfare that would emerge centuries later. It demonstrated that before you could weaponize an aqueduct, you first had to learn to think like the water itself, finding the hidden paths of least resistance. Numantia became a living laboratory for a new kind of warfare. While the Siege of Veii was a story of subterranean surprise, the conflict at Numantia, in what we now call 133 before Common Era, showcased the chilling efficiency of patient, total encirclement. The Roman commander, Scipio Aemilianus, did not seek a dramatic breach. His strategy was one of absolute control, a slow, methodical squeeze that transformed the entire landscape into a weapon. The city sat on a high, defensible hill, a natural fortress that had repelled Roman armies before. Scipio understood that a direct assault would be costly and likely futile. So he chose a different path, one defined by lines on a map. He ordered his legions to construct not one, but two massive walls completely encircling Numantia. The inner wall, facing the city, was a formidable barrier studded with watchtowers. The outer wall, facing away, protected the Roman forces from any relief army. This double ring of stone and earth, known as a circumvallation, was a statement of intent. It declared that nothing would get in and no one would get out. But walls alone do not win sieges. They simply create the conditions for a slower, more psychological victory. This is where the control of water became the central, silent actor in the drama. Numantia was not fed by a single, graceful aqueduct like later Roman cities. Its lifeblood was the river Douro and the network of smaller streams and springs in the surrounding valley. Scipio's engineers, applying the same principles they would use on an aqueduct, went to work on this natural watershed. They systematically located and diverted tributaries, channeling fresh water away from the city and toward the Roman camps. In some areas, they may have built small dams or redirected springs, ensuring every drop that once flowed toward Numantia now served the besieging army. The effect inside the city walls was a gradual, terrifying descent into scarcity. As months stretched on, the stored water in cisterns would have evaporated or been consumed. The once reliable streams outside the walls became dry beds, visible from the parapets but utterly unreachable. Thirst, as we have discussed, is a relentless and demoralizing foe. It saps strength, clouds judgment, and turns a community inward. Historical accounts, though sparse on the precise engineering details, vividly describe the extreme hardship that ultimately led the Numantines to surrender after an 8-month ordeal. The genius of Scipio's approach was its cold, calculated economy. He minimized Roman casualties while imposing a maximum cost on the defenders, not through combat but through engineered deprivation. Numantia was not defeated in a battle, it was methodically unmade by the control of its environment. This siege stands as a textbook example of how Roman military thinking had evolved. It was no longer just about armies clashing, it was about systems confronting one another. The Roman system of logistics, engineering, and patience proved stronger than the Celtiberian system of fortified defense. By mastering the hydrology of the region, Scipio demonstrated that the most critical terrain in a siege is not the high ground, but the watershed. He proved that victory could be piped away, one diverted stream at a time, long before the final gates were opened. This concept of total control would reach its most infamous and devastating expression generations later, in a siege that would test the limits of Roman engineering and ruthlessness. Jerusalem became a crucible where water, faith, and military science collided with terrible force. By the year 70, the city was a tinderbox of political and religious tension, a fortress of immense symbolic power that had openly defied Roman authority. When the future Emperor Titus arrived with his legions, his objective was not just victory, but a message of absolute, unanswerable control. The challenge was immense. Jerusalem was not supplied by a single, vulnerable aqueduct, but by a deeply ancient and resilient hydrological system centered on the Gihon Spring, a natural water source outside the city walls, and the Pool of Siloam, an expansive reservoir within. A network of tunnels, channels, and cisterns captured every precious drop of rainwater, making the city famously difficult to starve out through simple diversion. Titus, advised by his seasoned engineers, understood he had to think in terms of total systems. The historian Josephus, an eyewitness to the events, details the Roman response, a masterpiece of applied pressure. First, Titus ordered the construction of a massive circumvallation wall, a ring of stone and earth over 4 miles long, completely encircling Jerusalem. This wall, studded with 13 fortified camps, served a dual purpose. It prevented any escape or reinforcement, but just as critically, it severed every physical link the city had with the outside landscape, including its access to the Gihon Spring. The spring itself was now firmly in Roman-held territory. With control of the primary source, the engineers could begin a more subtle campaign. While grand aqueducts were absent, the channels and conduits that carried water from the spring into the city were tangible, physical features in the landscape. It is highly plausible, as many historians interpret from Josephus's accounts of extreme deprivation, that Roman teams systematically blocked or fouled these entry points. They would not need to poison the water in the classical sense. Simply rendering it inaccessible or contaminated with debris would achieve the same devastating effect. Inside the walls, the situation descended into a grim struggle. The vast cisterns, a point of pride, began to empty. The Pool of Siloam, once a bustling public space, became a contested and dwindling resource. As the siege stretched through months, the lack of clean water compounded a horrific famine. Josephus describes scenes of profound hardship where the basic necessities of life evaporated. The Roman strategy here was the culmination of everything learned from Veii and Numantia, applied with even greater scale and ruthlessness. It was a holistic assault on a city's entire ecosystem. By mastering the hydrology, Titus did more than deprive Jerusalem of water. He transformed its greatest source of resilience into a focal point of desperation and conflict. The eventual fall of the city and the destruction of the Second Temple marked a turning point in history. This siege stands as the starkest prelude to the empire's most famous and brutal siege engineering, a story not of a single aqueduct, but of the Roman will to dominate every element of the natural and built environment, turning even sacred springs into instruments of a calculated, terrible will. Masada stands as a monument to a final, impossible choice. After the fall of Jerusalem, the last remnants of the revolt against Rome retreated to this remote fortress, a sheer-sided plateau rising from the stark desert of Judea. For the Roman 10th Legion, tasked with eliminating this last pocket of defiance, Masada presented a unique and maddening challenge. Its defenses were not just walls but geography itself. Vertical cliffs hundreds of feet high made any conventional assault unthinkable. More importantly for our story, the defenders had mastered the art of survival in an arid landscape. They possessed no vulnerable aqueduct. Instead, they had turned the mountain itself into a reservoir. A network of enormous cisterns had been carved deep into the bedrock, designed to capture every precious drop from the rare, violent flash floods that swept through the surrounding wadis. These cisterns could hold millions of gallons, a supply calculated to last for years. Here, the classic Roman playbook of diversion or contamination was useless. You cannot redirect a flash flood that comes once a year, and you cannot poison a water supply sealed inside a mountain. The very nature of the fortress forced a complete tactical reversal. At Masada, the Romans were the ones with the water problem. To sustain a legion of thousands in the barren desert for a prolonged siege, they needed a reliable water source, and they needed it immediately. The solution was a staggering feat of military logistics. Historians like Josephus describe how the Romans established a main camp at a spring near the base of the mountain, but this alone was insufficient. They then engineered a system of channels and perhaps even used animal skins and carts to transport water from more distant sources, effectively creating a temporary, mobile aqueduct to serve their sprawling siege works. This effort supported the labor for their most famous creation, the colossal ramp. For months, thousands of Jewish prisoners of war and Roman soldiers moved an estimated 100,000 tons of earth and stone, building an artificial mountainside against the natural cliff. This ramp was not a weapon of water, but a weapon of sheer will, a brutal answer to a hydrological fortress. It was built to bring siege towers and a giant battering ram up to the fortress walls. The story's end is one of profound historical resonance, where the defenders made a final, tragic decision. When the Romans finally breached the wall at dawn, they entered a silent fortress. This case study completes a strategic arc. It shows that when faced with a defense that had internalized and secured its water supply, Roman engineering did not falter, it adapted. The legion became a mobile civil engineering corps, solving its own existential need for water in order to fuel the machine of conquest. Masada stands as the ultimate testament to Roman perseverance, proving that their greatest strength was not a specific tactic, but an unwavering mindset, a refusal to be defeated by any terrain, any fortress, or any natural limit. The true power of water as a weapon lay in the mind. For any ancient city, a steady, clean flow was far more than a utility. It was the physical proof of civic order, divine blessing, and social trust. When Roman engineers turned that flow against a population, they were not just attacking bodies, they were shattering a fundamental worldview. The psychological assault began the moment a public fountain sputtered and went dry. That sound, or rather, that sudden silence, was a message everyone understood. The gods had turned away, the leaders had failed, the community itself was now fractured as the shared certainty of a morning drink evaporated. This cultivated a deep, pervasive sense of betrayal. The very architecture that defined civilization, the graceful arches that brought life from the hills, had become a conduit for their own distress. Imagine the constant, gnawing anxiety. Every time a child took a sip from a dwindling household jar, a parent would wonder, is this safe? Has it been fouled? The fear of poison was perhaps the most corrosive weapon of all, transforming an act of basic survival into a potential death sentence. This dread was amplified by the unknown. The sound of distant digging, the rumor of enemy sappers somewhere in the dark channels beneath the streets, created a climate of paranoia. No place felt secure, not even the heart of one's own home, because the threat was literally flowing through the walls. For the commanders trapped inside, this psychological erosion was as dangerous as any legion. A soldier can stand on a wall with courage, but his resolve falters if he believes his family is slowly dying of thirst behind him. Civic cohesion unraveled. Desperate people facing the slow horror of dehydration would turn on each other. Riots over hidden cisterns or accusations of hoarding became common, as the social contract dissolved into a brutal struggle for individual survival. Leaders faced impossible choices, watching their authority drain away with the last of the water reserves. In this light, surrender was not an act of cowardice, but a rational choice for a return to order, for the simple, profound hope of a clean drink. The Roman engineers understood this human dimension perfectly. Their goal was never just to create thirst, but to manufacture despair. By weaponizing water, they attacked the story a city told itself about its own safety and permanence. They proved that the most resilient fortifications could be bypassed, not by scaling them, but by undermining the collective spirit of those within. The physical siege was only half the battle. The quieter, more insidious war was for the mind, and it was fought drop by terrifying drop. Even the most brilliant strategy casts a moral shadow. The Roman engineers who weaponized water operated in a world with its own, often contradictory, rules of engagement. While their tactics were celebrated as marks of superior intellect, they also sparked quiet debates about the very nature of honorable warfare. To understand their choices, we must step into the Roman mindset, where military necessity constantly negotiated with cultural ideals. The concept of ius in bello, the law of war, was not a strict legal code but a collection of customs, religious scruples, and practical restraints. Actions that brought swift, decisive victory against combatants were generally praised as the work of a great commander. Diverting an aqueduct to deprive a garrison of water could be framed as a clever stratagem, a bloodless way to force surrender and save Roman lives. It was a logical extension of siegecraft, admired for its efficiency. The historian Frontinus, in his collection of military stratagems, recounts such maneuvers with clear admiration, presenting them as examples of ingenious problem-solving rather than cruelty. The controlled flood, while devastating, could be justified as an act against fortifications, a use of the landscape akin to using fire or battering rams. It was a tool of the battlefield, however grand its scale. Yet other tactics crossed a more ambiguous line. The deliberate poisoning of water sources often drew criticism, even from Roman contemporaries. This was seen by some as a violation of an unspoken covenant, an act that targeted the innocent and the defenseless indiscriminately. The historian Cassius Dio, writing about various conflicts, sometimes notes such actions with a tone of distaste, implying they were tactics of desperation or marks of a commander's excessive harshness. Why this distinction? Poisoning was insidious and invisible. It turned the fundamental act of drinking, something shared by soldier and child alike, into a lethal trap. It caused prolonged, indiscriminate suffering that was difficult to control or contain. This clashed with the Roman ideal of virtus, which combined courage, discipline, and a certain forthrightness in conflict. There was no glory in defeating an enemy already crippled by disease, no honor in watching a city perish from within by a means that felt deceitful and unclean. The tension here reveals a profound cultural calculation. the Romans viewed their empire as a force of order and civilization. Excessive, visibly brutal methods against civilian populations could undermine that narrative, breeding lasting hatred and making conquered peoples harder to govern. A commander who used every possible tool without restraint might win a battle but lose the peace, damaging his own reputation and Rome's moral authority. So these hydrological weapons existed in a gray area. Their acceptability depended on perception, on who wielded them and how they were framed. Was it a strategic diversion or a war crime? The answer often lay in the result. A swift victory following a diverted aqueduct could be celebrated. A prolonged, agonizing siege ended by poison might be remembered with a silent unease, a victory tinged with shame. These ancient debates are not just historical footnotes. They force us to see these engineering feats not as neutral acts of science, but as conscious ethical choices. They remind us that the story of water in war is not only about pressure and volume, but also about power, perception, and the fragile lines societies draw, even in their most desperate conflicts between cleverness and cruelty. A city under siege was not a static target, but a living organism fighting for survival. The moment Roman engineers identified the aqueduct as a weakness, the defenders' own engineers began a desperate race to protect it. This was not a story of passive suffering, but of brilliant reactive innovation, a silent arms race conducted in stone and water. The first and most critical line of defense was secrecy and redundancy. Knowing that a single source was a single point of failure, city planners and military architects invested heavily in hidden, secondary systems. The most famous example is, of course, Masada, where vast cisterns carved into bedrock made the fortress nearly impervious to water siege. But this principle was applied in less extreme forms across the empire. Within older cities, networks of secret wells were dug, known only to a trusted few. Private homes of the wealthy often had their own deep cisterns, lined with waterproof plaster, collecting rainwater from rooftops. Public cisterns, massive underground chambers, were built in discreet locations, filled during times of peace as an emergency reserve. This created a hydrological backup, a hidden life support system meant to outlast an enemy's patience. The aqueduct itself, however, still needed active guardianship. Cities would post permanent guards at the Caput, the aqueduct head where the water was drawn from the spring or river, often miles from the city walls. These were not simple sentries, but inspectors trained to look for signs of tampering, a new dam upstream, or unusual debris in the flow. They would walk the channel's course regularly, checking the stonework for fresh breaches or evidence of tunneling. In some sophisticated systems, engineers designed complex distribution tanks called casella with sluice gates and valves. If intelligence or scouts reported that an upstream section had been compromised or poisoned, these gates could be slammed shut, isolating the contaminated segment and preserving the clean water already within the city's internal pipes. It was a primitive but effective form of quarantine. Perhaps the most fascinating countermeasures were architectural. Some cities, learning from bitter experience, began to build their aqueduct channels with defensive features. Sections that were vulnerable might be constructed as buried tunnels rather than elevated arcades, making them harder to locate and breach. Critical arches could be reinforced, and access points were minimized and heavily fortified. There are even accounts, though debated, of defenders creating their own counterfloods. By deliberately damming the aqueduct inside the city walls and then releasing it, they could potentially scour away enemy sappers working at the base of their walls, turning the Romans' own tactic back on them. This dynamic exchange reveals the true nature of ancient siegecraft. It was not a one-sided application of force, but a dialogue of ingenuity. Every Roman diversion spurred the invention of a hidden cistern. Every attempt at poisoning led to more vigilant guards and better filtration systems. The aqueduct, a symbol of open civic benefit, became the focal point for a closed, secretive war of engineering minds. The defenders were always adapting, always thinking one step ahead, because the cost of failure was written in the dust of dry fountains and the desperation of a people betrayed by their own greatest achievement. The Roman playbook for water warfare was never truly lost. It was copied, studied, and adapted long after the last legion disbanded. Medieval and Renaissance commanders, often educated in classical texts, recognized the timeless logic of controlling an enemy's lifeline. The strategies pioneered by Roman engineers became part of a permanent military tradition, their principles echoing through sieges for more than 1,000 years. One of the most dramatic examples unfolded in the spring of 1453, during the final, epic siege of Constantinople. The great city, though diminished, still relied in part on its ancient Roman aqueduct system, the Aqueduct of Veii, which brought water from the Thracian forests. As the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II prepared his final assault, his advisors understood that severing this flow could cripple the defense. Historical accounts suggest Ottoman forces worked to damage or block sections of the aqueduct channel outside the walls, aiming to deprive the city of a steady water supply and compound the hardships of the trapped population. While the city's many cisterns provided a crucial buffer, the attempt itself is telling. It shows a direct intellectual lineage, a 15th century sultan applying a 1st century Roman tactic to conquer the last remnant of the Roman Empire itself. The logic had not changed, only the actors. Centuries later, on the sun-baked island of Malta, the same brutal calculus played out during the Great Siege of 1565. Here, the conflict was not over soaring aqueducts, but over the island's scarce and precious groundwater. The Ottoman forces and the defending Knights of St. John fought with ferocious intensity for control of specific wells and cisterns. Possession of a single freshwater spring could determine the viability of a defensive position or the health of an entire battalion. The siege became, in part, a war of hydrology, with both sides launching raids not just for territory, but for a few precious barrels of water. The Knights' successful defense was due as much to their control of these internal water sources and their careful rationing as it was to their courage on the walls. This continuity across the ages reveals a profound truth about warfare. The principles established beside the aqueducts of Numantia and Jerusalem, control the water and you control the fate of the siege, are not bound to a specific empire or technology. They are fundamental. They apply wherever humans gather behind walls and require water to live. From the stone channels of the Romans to the fortified cisterns of Malta, the lesson was the same. Infrastructure is not just a backdrop for battle, it is the battlefield itself. This enduring legacy bridges ancient and early modern military thought, proving that the most powerful weapons are sometimes not weapons at all, but ideas about leverage, patience, and the silent, relentless pressure of necessity. Soil and stone hold memories of water's wartime role. The strategies of diversion and flood were not just recorded in ancient texts, they left physical scars on the landscape, waiting for modern archaeologists to interpret. This forensic approach to history turns silent ruins into compelling testimony, allowing us to verify the accounts of Livy, Josephus, and others. How do we move from written descriptions to tangible proof? The evidence often lies in subtle disturbances, in the layers of earth that captured a single, violent moment centuries ago. Consider the silt deposits within an ancient aqueduct channel. A steady, maintained flow leaves a predictable pattern of sediment, but a sudden, catastrophic event, like the deliberate breaching of an upstream dam, would send a massive surge of water and debris crashing down the conduit. This event would be frozen in time as a distinct, chaotic layer of unusually coarse gravel and sand embedded in the channel floor, a geological signature of a military operation. Conversely, a long-term diversion would leave a different mark, a layer of fine, wind-blown dust settling in a dry, abandoned channel, telling a story of silence where there once was flow. Beyond the aqueducts themselves, the footprints of the besieging armies reveal their hydrological intentions. Excavations of Roman siege camps, those temporary cities of conquest, frequently uncover evidence of water management on an industrial scale. Archaeologists find not just a few simple wells, but extensive networks of drainage ditches, carefully lined holding reservoirs, and complex canal systems diverting local streams. This infrastructure, far beyond what was needed for a legion's basic survival, points to a deliberate, large-scale effort to control the entire watershed. It is the physical blueprint of a strategy, the earthworks of a general who thought in terms of rivers and gradients. In rare, vivid instances, the human actors in this drama leave their own marks. At sites like Masada, inscriptions or simple graffiti scratched into stone by Roman soldiers have been found near siege works, sometimes noting their unit or a complaint about the hard labor. While not directly describing water operations, these personal traces confirm the presence and activities of the engineering corps at the precise locations where hydrological control was paramount. Perhaps the most dramatic evidence comes from the points of violent contact. At several sites across the former empire, sections of aqueduct arcades near city walls show clear signs of targeted destruction. Massive stone blocks are not simply collapsed from age, but appear to have been deliberately toppled inward or shattered, with fracture patterns inconsistent with an earthquake or gradual decay. This damage aligns perfectly with historical accounts of defenders sabotaging their own aqueducts to prevent enemy infiltration, or of attackers breaching the channels to create a flood or deny water during a final assault. Each scarred stone is a puzzle piece. When combined with the silt layers, the camp reservoirs, and the fragmentary inscriptions, a coherent picture emerges from the dirt. We are no longer just reading about a siege, we are standing on its hydrological battlefield, seeing the trenches dug by long-vanished soldiers and touching the channels they fought to control. This archaeological testimony does more than confirm history. It adds a profound layer of physical truth, reminding us that these brilliant, brutal strategies were not abstract concepts, but concrete actions that reshaped the very earth beneath our feet. The principles of ancient siegecraft never faded, they simply upgraded their tools. The Roman engineers who diverted aqueducts were practicing an early form of what modern security experts call critical infrastructure warfare. Their target was the same, the vital systems a society depends on for order, health, and survival. They understood that to collapse a city's spirit, you first compromise its foundational networks. Today, that battlefield has expanded into the digital realm, but the strategic playbook remains hauntingly familiar. Instead of sappers digging at stone channels, we now face the threat of cyber attacks aimed at power grids, water treatment plants, and financial networks. The objective is identical: to create cascading chaos, to erode public trust, and to force a change in behavior through engineered hardship. This is the enduring lesson of asymmetric conflict, where a sophisticated understanding of an opponent's weaknesses can outweigh sheer military might. The Romans used topography and hydrology as their map. Today's actors use network diagrams and code. But the goal of turning a civilization's own complexity against itself is a thread that runs from the siege of Jerusalem to the vulnerabilities in our own hyper-connected cities. We have built a world of incredible interdependence, where the failure of one system can trigger failures in dozens of others, a reality the Roman commanders would have understood immediately. Their aqueducts were the internet of their day, a physical network that bound the city together and made it function. To attack it was to demonstrate a profound and unsettling truth, that the very innovations which make a society strong also create its most critical points of failure. This perspective forces a sobering reflection. We marvel at Roman engineering, but we must also recognize the dark mirror it holds up to our own time. The fusion of deep technical knowledge with strategic intent is a constant in human conflict. It asks us to look at our own world not just with pride in its connectivity, but with a clear-eyed assessment of a Roman architectus militaris. Where are our modern aqueducts? What are the systems so essential that their disruption would cause not just inconvenience, but a fundamental crisis of confidence? The answers are all around us in the substations, the server farms, and the pipelines. Understanding the past, therefore, is not just about historical curiosity, it is a form of preparedness. It reminds us that the security of a society is measured not only by the strength of its walls, but by the resilience of the networks that flow within them. The legends surrounding these sieges are often more dramatic than the historical truth. Our modern imaginations, fueled by cinematic portrayals, tend to envision Roman engineers dropping vials of instant, lethal poison into pristine water channels. The reality was far more mundane and in many ways more insidious. Fast-acting toxins as we know them were likely beyond the practical reach of ancient armies. Creating, transporting, and effectively dispersing a substance potent enough to sicken thousands through a vast, flowing channel presented enormous logistical hurdles. What was far more feasible and frequently documented in the context of ancient warfare was the deliberate introduction of biological contaminants. This meant dumping animal remains, human waste, or other decaying matter into the water source. The goal was not an instant kill, but to seed the water with bacteria and pathogens that would cause widespread illness, dysentery, and fever over time. It was a weapon of attrition, not of instant drama, designed to weaken a population's health and morale through prolonged suffering rather than a single, shocking event. Similarly, the image of every Roman siege featuring a grand aqueduct diversion is a simplification. These hydrological tactics were not a universal first resort. They were specialized tools pulled from the arsenal only when the specific conditions were right. The terrain had to allow for it. The city's water source had to be identifiable and accessible upstream, and the Roman commander had to be prepared for a potentially lengthy operation. In many sieges, time was a luxury they did not have, or the city's defenses made such an approach too risky. Storming a wall might have been considered a faster, if bloodier, solution. The decision was always a cold calculation of cost versus benefit, of Roman lives versus time. To understand what really happened, we must look critically at our sources. The Roman historians who recorded these events, like Josephus or Livy, were often writing for a Roman audience with agendas that mixed fact with propaganda. A general's clever diversion of an aqueduct made for a better story of intellectual triumph than a grim account of poisoning wells, which could be seen as dishonorable. Their accounts might emphasize the brilliance of the engineering while softening the brutal human toll. Conversely, the archaeological record, while invaluable, has its own gaps. We can find the silt of a flood or the ruins of a dam, but it is much harder to find direct evidence of a one-time act of contamination that left no permanent structural mark. The truth lies in the intersection of these lines of evidence, in the convergence of a written account with a physical scar on the landscape. Separating the sensational myth from the documented practice does not diminish the Roman achievement. If anything, it makes it more impressive. It reveals their military engineering not as a series of cinematic, fantastical moments, but as a relentless, applied science. It was a discipline of patience, geography, and logistics. The real story is not about magic poisons, but about the profound understanding that a city's health was a system, and that system could be studied, mapped, and deliberately undermined. This shift in perspective moves us from the realm of legend into the clearer, more sobering light of historical analysis, where the true nature of their power comes into sharper, and perhaps more unsettling, focus. Every engineering decision on the battlefield carried a price tag. Damming a river or digging a mile-long tunnel was not just a tactical choice, it was a profound economic calculation. The Roman military machine operated with the cold logic of an imperial corporation, constantly weighing the cost of materials and manpower against the ultimate prize of victory. To understand why they invested so heavily in hydrological warfare, we must look past the stone and water to the ledgers and lives behind them. The most valuable resource in the Roman Empire was not gold, but the trained legionary. A professional soldier represented years of investment in recruitment, training, equipment, and pay. Losing thousands in a frontal assault on a city's walls was not just a tragedy, it was a catastrophic depletion of state capital. A prolonged siege using conventional methods also drained the treasury, requiring constant shipments of food, pay, and supplies for a stationary army that could number in the tens of thousands. In this light, the massive initial investment in aqueduct weaponization starts to make ruthless financial sense. The labor, while enormous, was often free from a state perspective. It was performed by the soldiers themselves during a siege's quiet periods, or by the vast populations of enslaved peoples captured in previous campaigns. Their toil transformed the landscape into a weapon, and their effort was a one-time cost, compared to the recurring, open-ended expense of feeding a besieging army for an extra year, or the incalculable cost of replacing veteran centurions. Diverting an aqueduct was a bargain. It was a classic example of spending resources to save a more valuable one. The goal was to achieve what economists call force multiplication, where a single clever application of effort yields disproportionate results. A few hundred men digging a diversion channel for a month could achieve what 10,000 men charging a wall might not, and they would live to fight another day. This calculus explains the patience exhibited at sieges like Numantia or Jerusalem. Roman commanders were playing a long game, confident that their empire's deep reserves of labor and logistics would outlast any local defender's reserves of water and will. The true efficiency of aqueduct warfare lay in its targeted impact. It applied pressure directly to the enemy's weakest point, their dependence on a single, fragile system, while conserving Roman strength. This was not warfare of passion, but of spreadsheet and strategy. It reflected a civilization that had mastered the art of projecting power not through reckless bravery, but through sustainable, repeatable systems of control. The echoing silence of a dry fountain in a besieged city was not just a psychological weapon. It was the sound of a balance sheet tipping inexorably in Rome's favor. The landscape itself was a casualty of these campaigns. When Roman engineers weaponized water, they did more than defeat a city, they rewrote the geography of the region. These were not temporary fieldworks cleared away after victory. The diversion of a river, the construction of a massive dam, the excavation of miles of siege trenches, these acts permanently scarred the earth. The environmental impact was profound and often irreversible, turning the siege site into a monument to engineered change. Consider a river redirected to starve a city. Its original bed, once a vibrant corridor for life, would slowly silt up and become a barren gully. The new course carved by legionary labor would flood areas that had been dry for centuries, drowning forests or farmland to create the artificial lake held behind a military dam. Local ecosystems built over generations were dismantled in a matter of months. Fish populations would collapse, water tables would shift, and the flora and fauna dependent on that specific hydrological balance would simply vanish. This was an early, deliberate form of large-scale environmental modification, all in service of a single military objective. The physical transformation required staggering amounts of material. Building the siege ramp at Masada or the circumvallation walls at Jerusalem demanded more than just dirt, it demanded trees. Vast tracts of nearby forest were clear-cut to provide the timber needed for shoring up tunnels, building siege engines, and reinforcing earthworks. This deforestation had its own lasting consequences, leading to soil erosion on hillsides and altering local microclimates. The land was stripped not only of its defenders, but of its natural cover. What we see, then, is a double conquest. The Romans conquered the city, and in the process they conquered the very terrain that surrounded it. They molded valleys and hills into weapons, treating rivers as logistical problems to be solved and forests as raw material to be consumed. This perspective adds a sobering layer to our understanding. The legacy of a siege was not just political or historical, it was ecological. In some places, that legacy is still written on the land. The faint, linear traces of a circumvallation wall visible from the air, the unnatural mound of a siege ramp against a cliff face, the subtle deviation in an old river's path, these are silent testaments. They remind us that the ambition of Roman military projects was measured not just in territory gained, but in landscapes permanently altered. The earth itself bears the memory of their calculated will. A lasting imprint of the day water was turned from a source of life into an instrument of war, and the land was forced to comply. A city's water system was its most closely guarded secret. To weaponize an aqueduct, Roman commanders first needed to know its anatomy in exquisite detail, from the distant spring that fed it to the last public fountain in the poorest district. This was not a task for scouts alone, but for a network of agents operating in the shadows long before the first legionary standard appeared on the horizon. Successful hydrological warfare depended on exquisite intelligence, a quiet campaign of information gathering that turned maps into weapons. Roman military culture understood that knowledge of the land was as vital as swords or siege engines. Long before a formal siege was declared, agents would be dispatched to the target region. These men were not always soldiers. They could be merchants traveling with caravans, diplomats on official visits, or even scholars studying local geography. Their mission was to observe, to listen, and to ask subtle questions. They needed to pinpoint exactly where a city's aqueduct drew its water. Was it a single spring high in the hills or a series of streams tapped along a river valley? They would trace the channel's path across the countryside, noting where it ran above ground on graceful arches and where it dove into a buried tunnel, a potential vulnerability. Perhaps most critically, they sought information on the city's internal reserves. Where were the main cisterns? How much water could they hold? Were there secret wells known only to the city elders? This information was gold. To gather it, Roman intelligence employed a range of methods. Bribery was a common and effective tool. A local shepherd who grazed his flocks near the aqueduct source could, for a few silver coins, reveal the exact location and whether it was guarded. A disgruntled water seller inside the city might be persuaded to sketch the layout of the distribution tanks. In other cases, interrogation was used. Merchants captured on the road or deserters from the city's garrison could be questioned, not just about troop numbers, but about the flow of water through the pipes and the mood of the populace. This intelligence was then synthesized into actionable plans for the Architectus Militaris, the military engineer. He did not operate on guesswork. With detailed reports in hand, he could calculate with precision. He would know the optimal spot to build a diversion dam, choosing a location where the channel was accessible and the terrain favored his earthworks. He could identify a stretch of aqueduct that was shallowly buried, a perfect point for sappers to begin tunneling. He could estimate how long the city's cisterns would last under total blockade, setting the timeline for the entire siege. This integrated system reveals the sophisticated nature of Roman military operations. There was no separation between spies, engineers, and soldiers. They were all parts of a single machine. The intelligence agent's whispered report directly informed the engineer's blueprint, which in turn dictated the legion's movements. It was a seamless linkage of information, planning, and force, a system of war that functioned with a modern level of coordination. Knowing where an aqueduct was most vulnerable was indeed half the battle. It transformed the massive, daunting stone structure from an impenetrable lifeline into a diagram of weaknesses, a set of levers waiting to be pulled by a commander who had done his quiet homework long before the first trumpet sounded the advance. The Romans did not invent the idea of using water as a weapon, but they perfected it into a science. Other great empires of the ancient world certainly understood the power of controlling a water source. The Assyrians, feared for their brutal siege tactics, were known to divert rivers to flood enemy lands or undermine city walls, creating temporary moats to isolate their targets. The Persians, in their vast campaigns, might reroute a stream to deprive a fortress. Even the Greeks, during the Peloponnesian War, saw instances where armies tampered with local water supplies. These were powerful, often devastating, tactical choices, yet they remained just that, individual choices, brilliant improvisations by a particular general facing a specific problem. There was no manual, no permanent core dedicated to the art, no institutional memory ensuring the tactic would be studied, refined, and reliably applied in the next campaign. What separates Rome is not the spark of the idea, but the relentless system built around it. While an Assyrian king might command a flood, a Roman consul commanded an entire department of specialists whose sole purpose was to think in terms of hydrology and leverage. The Architectus Militaris was a permanent professional officer. His knowledge of siphons, gradients, and structural mechanics was not a personal hobby, it was a military qualification. This transformed water warfare from a sporadic trick into a standard, repeatable component of imperial strategy. It became a box to be checked during campaign planning, as routine as ordering grain supplies or scouting cavalry routes. The Roman system created a feedback loop of institutional knowledge. Lessons learned diverting a stream in Spain were documented, debated, and could inform a plan to undermine an aqueduct in Gaul decades later. This accumulation of practiced expertise meant that a Roman commander, even one new to a theater of war, had access to a vast, shared playbook of hydrological solutions. A Persian or Greek commander had to be personally brilliant. A Roman commander had the full weight of an engineering tradition behind him, a tradition that turned landscape analysis into a predictable formula for victory. This comparative view does not diminish the ingenuity of other cultures. Instead, it clarifies the unique nature of Roman power. Their genius was not merely in building aqueducts, but in building the first military-industrial complex capable of weaponizing them with systematic, bureaucratic efficiency. They moved water warfare from the realm of inspired tactics into the realm of applied engineering, making the environment itself a loyal and predictable ally of the legions. Our hypothetical target is a Gallic oppidum, a fortified hilltop town. The challenge begins not at its walls, but miles away in the forested hills. The engineer's first task is pure detective work, a silent reconnaissance to find the single spring feeding the town's modest aqueduct. He sends out small, skilled patrols not to fight but to observe. They follow the stone channel backward from where it enters the town's defenses, tracing its path across valleys and through wooded slopes. Their goal is to find the caput aquae, the aqueduct head, often a simple stone chamber capturing a hillside spring. This is the system's beating heart, and its location, perhaps in a secluded grove, determines everything. The engineer needs to know, is it guarded? Is the terrain around it suitable for large-scale earth moving? Can his men work there without being seen from the town's watchtowers? Every answer shapes the plan. Once the source is confirmed, the real calculation begins. He consults his notes on water volume and channel slope, estimates the spring's flow. How much water must he divert to cripple the town? He doesn't need to stop it completely, just reduce it to a trickle. Now he must design the diversion. The quarter-mile upstream from the spring, he identifies a narrow point in the valley. Here, his legionaries will become dam builders. The labor estimate is staggering. To construct an earthen dam strong enough to withstand the water's pressure, they will need to move thousands of tons of soil and rock. He calculates the number of men, the shifts, the duration. 500 men working in 10-hour shifts around the clock might complete the core structure in 8 days, but they need timber for reinforcement, baskets for moving earth, and pickaxes for digging the new channel that will carry the diverted water safely away from the worksite and toward the Roman camp. This is not just a military operation, it is a major construction project in hostile territory. Security is a constant, gnawing concern. The work site is vulnerable. If the Gauls discover the operation, they will launch sorties to disrupt it. The engineer must plan for this. He designs a defensive perimeter around the dam site, a palisade of sharpened stakes with watchtowers, manned by a dedicated cohort of infantry. Their job is not to build, but to protect the builders. The noise of construction, the cleared trees, the movement of men, all risk detection. The timeline is a race against that discovery. Every day the dam rises unseen is a day closer to silent victory. The points of failure are numerous. A sudden storm could flood the unfinished works. A rock layer too hard to dig through could delay the diversion channel. A Gallic patrol could stumble upon the operation, forcing a costly fight that reveals the plan. The engineer must have contingencies for each. Perhaps a secondary, smaller diversion point is scouted as a backup. Maybe decoy attacks are planned on another section of the wall to draw the defender's attention. This mental exercise strips away the abstraction. We see the aqueduct not as a line on a map, but as a series of practical problems, each requiring a solution grounded in geometry, logistics, and disciplined labor. It forces us to appreciate the Roman engineer not as a mythical figure, but as a master project manager under extreme pressure, a thinker who could translate a strategic goal into 10,000 specific tasks, from felling a single tree to posting a sentry in the rain. The stone channel becomes a living puzzle, its every contour a question demanding an answer. The silence of the fountains was only the beginning of the crisis. Inside the city walls, the slow, agonizing reality of a water siege unfolded not as a single event, but as a daily, grinding erosion of everything that made a community function. To understand the true power of the Roman strategy, we must move past the engineering diagrams and step into the dusty streets of a city whose lifeline has been cut. The moment the public fountains ran dry, a new and brutal form of mathematics took over, the arithmetic of strict rationing. City officials would be forced to make impossible choices, allocating the dwindling water in the main cisterns first to soldiers on the walls, then perhaps to essential craftsmen, leaving families with a cruel and shrinking allowance. Every jug, every cup became a measured treasure. This calculated scarcity triggered a cascade of collapse. The first casualty was often public health. Without water to wash, to clean streets, or to flush away waste, sanitation dissolved. The very air would grow thick and foul, creating the perfect conditions for illness to spread. Historical accounts from sieges like Jerusalem describe outbreaks of disease that rivaled the threat of thirst itself, a double burden on a population already under immense strain. In this environment, a terrible choice presented itself daily. A desperate citizen, parched and seeing their children suffer, might stare at a murky puddle in a broken cistern or a contaminated stream still trickling through a compromised aqueduct channel. Knowing the water could bring sickness, even a slow and painful passing, they would drink it anyway, choosing the immediate relief of a wet throat over the abstract fear of a fever to come. This was the psychological trap of the poisoned aqueduct made horrifically personal. As the days stretched into weeks, the social fabric, woven from trust and shared custom, began to tear. The shared hardship that might initially unite a community curdled into suspicion and violence. Neighbors would accuse each other of hoarding secret supplies. Brawls could erupt over a place in line at a guarded well. The historian Josephus, recounting the siege of Jerusalem, writes of a darkness that settled over the city, where the bonds of family and faith were tested beyond breaking. He describes scenes of profound hardship, where the extremes of hunger and thirst led to unthinkable acts of desperation, a stark testament to how quickly civilization can unravel when its most fundamental resource is stripped away. This fracturing of order was as much a military objective for the Romans as breaching the wall itself. A city divided by thirst is a city that cannot mount a coordinated defense. The grim reality inside those walls is the ultimate, sobering measure of the Roman engineers' success. Their elegant channels and calculated dams were not abstract feats of intellect, they were delivery systems for a specific kind of terror. Every diverted gallon, every contaminated stream, translated directly into a mother's anguish, a child's illness, and a community's descent into fear and conflict. This human cost forces us to view these hydrological strategies not merely as clever tactics, but as profound acts of psychological and physical pressure. It reminds us that the legacy of ancient warfare is written not only in treaties and conquered lands, but in the silent, desperate choices made in the shadow of a dry fountain, where the true weight of engineered water becomes heartbreakingly clear. The graceful arches that once carried life now stand as silent monuments to a profound duality. We have traced the journey of these structures from serene symbols of civic order to calculated instruments of imperial will, uncovering the methods of diversion, contamination, flooding, and infiltration that transformed civil engineering into a dark art of siegecraft. We have met the minds behind the machines, witnessed the desperate innovations of cities fighting for survival, and followed a legacy that stretches from ancient watersheds to our own networked world. This exploration reveals a fundamental truth about the nature of power itself. True dominion flows not only through the strength of legions, but through the channels of knowledge and the deliberate control of the environment. It is the power to give life and the power to withhold it, to build a marvel and to know precisely how to break it. The next time you see an image of a Roman aqueduct curving across a distant landscape, remember it was never just a lifeline. In the hands of a determined empire, that same stone channel could also become a leash, a reminder that the greatest vulnerabilities are often woven into our greatest achievements. If this hidden history of ancient strategy has captivated you, there are countless more mysteries waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe to continue this journey into the past and share your own thoughts on these formidable tactics in the comments below.